Hi, John Carter here, broker and owner at RE/MAX River City, and we want to talk today about RPRs versus title insurance. It's a very common debate these days in our market in Edmonton and area, and we just had a training this morning from one of our in-house legal counsels, David Henderick from Jackie Henderick and Forster, and they gave an excellent kind of hour-and-a-half presentation, lots of Q&A from our agents, but I wanted to do a quick form video just to help dispel some of the myths. So the biggest thing that I took away from the presentation this morning is that the question of which is better, RPR versus title insurance, starts with depends on who you're representing. So if you're representing a buyer, and the way he put it is, if I was buying a home, I would want a real property report. You want to clearly know what you're buying, that the fences, the decks, the garage, any concrete pads, things like that are to compliance with the city, that you're not going to at some later time have to move them or replace them. So when representing a buyer, you really want a real property report. However, when you represent a seller, it's easiest to offer title insurance, and that's where a lot of the conflict in transactions comes into play. So what does real property reports cover you for? Why do you want a real property report? So the key things to look for in a real property report are, it shows the house, obviously, that's what you're buying, the land and building, any garages, any concrete poured, so permanent structures like sidewalks, driveways, things like that. Decks, however, if it's under 2 feet tall with the deck, like the surface of the deck is under 2 feet tall, it's an option whether or not the surveyor can choose to show that on the RPR. The other one you want to have is sheds, if they're permanent in nature. And so the big question there is, what about a shed that sits on a wood foundation? Is that permanent? What about a shed that fits on concrete foundation? So concrete is generally deemed to be a more permanent structure, and wood foundation is, again, debatable by the surveyor whether or not they choose to include it. And especially if it's like a movable shed sitting on patio stones, there's no requirement to show that on the RPR. However, if it's too close to fence lines or property lines, it may have to be moved at a later date, but the buyer can choose to accept it as it is. Fences is a big one that we often have issues of egress, which means the fence has gone over the property line, maybe into a neighboring property line or into City of Edmonton property or even Crown land property in some rural instances. So fences are important to know where they lie and if they're in compliance. However, you can get solutions for that. So the seller could apply to get an easement from the city. There's a fee and a process involved in that. And in many cases, people are okay just to accept the fence as it is. And if and when they go to replace it and they have to move it, they're happy to deal with that. Hot tubs is one that doesn't come up as often. Hot tubs need to be shown in an RPR, and any in-ground swimming pools and even above-ground swimming pools, if it's like a deck, if it's been built up, it's over 2 feet, and it's, a swimming pool is fairly permanent, and there's some wiggle room in there, I think, depending on all situations, but those all as well have to be shown on a real property report. So really goes to, how do you deal with this with clients? And so the big takeaway we had was making sure that you're bringing the client, as a seller, involved, bringing up the real property report early. There's no database for real property reports, so you have to physically have your last real property report. So they might have it in an old file, perhaps the lawyer's office who handled their purchase might have it on file that they can request it. Otherwise, they need to request a new one to be prepared by a land surveyor. Approximate cost is $400 to $600 in Edmonton typically, and timelines can range, depends how busy they are. And then it has to be submitted to the county or the city for compliance and kind of approval to confirm that everything's there, matches records that were pulled as far as permits for fences being built, things like that, or if permits weren't pulled, that they actually match, what's there is in compliance, meaning there isn't a fence that goes over the property line, or a deck that was built too big, or a garage or other buildings that pass the total lot percentage coverage. So why, as a buyer, do you want the real property report instead of title insurance? the biggest question, or the biggest safeguard there is you want to know exactly what you own. As a buyer, you want to know what you're taking on, what you're assuming. If there's big issues, might have been a garage that was built 30 years ago and was 5 feet too close to the property line. If you go to now do a renovation on your garage, or rebuild your garage, maybe you want to build a garage suite, you might find out you have to move that garage 5 feet, which could eat into your yard or things like that. So typically things are kind of grandfathered, but that doesn't mean the city can't come along and when they're doing maintenance of some kind, make you remove your fence, and it's the seller's cost to deal with that. So as realtors, our job is to educate the client, really show them all the options, explain the pros and cons, and we advise our realtors and our clients to bring the lawyer in early. Have the lawyer review that real property report during your condition timeline. The biggest thing that happens a lot of times is the buyer doesn't care, but their lender might. And so their lender will require the real property report in order to fund the loan. And they may not agree to fund if there's issues that may be expensive to remedy that wouldn't be covered with title insurance. So the best course of action is to add in a condition or a term that the seller is to provide a copy of the real property report as a condition on its own or before the due date of the property inspection or financing condition. If that's going to be contingent on your financing or your insurance or on your satisfaction with the property as a buyer, you want to make sure to look at that up front, and you might even bring the lawyer in at that time to look at it. Lawyers don't go to the property physically. That's the realtor's job, is to be that liaison between what they physically saw at the property and then what's showing on the real property report. So working as a team, we help get great results for clients, protect them against these pitfalls, and make for a happy, smooth home ownership experience. So feel free to comment any questions below, and happy to answer those or clarify them as well. And we'll have another video in the future talking specifically about title insurance and permits and requirements and what's covered with various title insurance policies and what isn't. So stay tuned for that.